Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, we're getting to do a podcast that I had scheduled, and it was so ironic because I wanted to talk about the climate crisis, climate change again. And of course, our authority for that is Dr. Jerry Schnur out at the University of Iowa. He's a returnee to the podcast, a friend of the PBG. I was going to get him on, and then, wow, this thing came through the state of Iowa called a derecho. And I'm like, what the hell? I'm 65 years old. I used to be in the news business. Anybody that's doing news, you got to have your hand a little bit on whether it's a big breaking news story. I never heard of a derecho. I've lived here except for 6 months now, my entire life. I'd never heard the term. Maybe I'm just not as connected as I used to be, but this thing came through and it was, 20, 30 miles wide. Maybe it was clear across the entire state. It had wind gusts of 140 miles an hour, they say, out in eastern Iowa. It was bad at my place. Knocked me out of power for 4 days. I got behind on my podcast, and so now we're just getting back with Jerry Schnur. And as far as the climate crisis, I spend a lot of time covering this, and folks wonder why. And I tell them, well, there are some things I got to cover. Politics, right at the top of the list. But the climate crisis deserves to be covered because, like I tell folks, we're living in a 2020 world. Nuclear missiles from a Trident submarine can kill everybody on the planet in 20 minutes. Climate change, climate crisis, if we don't get a handle on it, PDQ, I think it's going to kill everybody on the planet in 20 years. So that's the 2020 world that I talk about. And I also wanted to start off here to get us going with this just a brief excerpt. I want to read from Lee Camp's new book that I have been highlighting here on the show. I won't spend a lot of time doing this. If folks watch Democracy Now! Or Tom Hartman, they'll see Tom reading from a book, and I'm not going to do a lot of that, but I want to read this one little open here. Lee Camp says, I don't just mean there should be a report every couple of hours about climate change by our bloviating bullhorns of mainstream news. I don't mean once a day you should mention to a friend that Al Gore seems vaguely douchey and probably has a point. I mean, climate change should be all we're thinking about. It should be a major factor in every conversation, every job, every TV show, every humor column, every tweet, every clever t-shirt slogan, and every fortune cookie message. Climate change should be everything because, as he points out, we got a minute to live. If you superimpose that doomsday clock over the time that mankind's been on the planet, we've got about a minute to deal with that. Okay, that's my open. That's going to get us to the good Dr. Jerry Schnur. Welcome back to a podcast by George, Doc.
Great to be here, George.
Now, Jerry Schnur, for folks that don't know, he's the co-director and co-founder of the Iowa Environmental Focus, a product of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research. It's a nonprofit source for Iowa-specific news, analysis, research, and commentary on the environment. It covers a range of topics, including air and water quality, climate change, extreme weather, sustainable communities, and green energy. I love his background in education. He holds a degree from Iowa State University and the University of Texas, Austin. He joined the University of Iowa faculty in 1977. I don't know how much that happens anymore. People educated at Iowa State go to the University of Iowa. I guess it happens, but it happened back then. He currently holds
Iowa State didn't want me, George.
Yeah. He currently holds the Allen S. Henry Chair in Engineering. He teaches civil and environmental engineering as well as occupational and environmental health. His specific fields of knowledge include water quality modeling, aquatic chemistry, and, of course, climate change. Okay, Jerry, let's talk about a little bit to start with about that derecho thing. I honest to God, I'd never heard about it. Were you familiar with that weather occurrence? What is that? And is that related to climate change?
Yes, I think it is related to climate change, but there's so few of those events. The term was coined, derecho, actually by a physics professor at the University of Iowa over 100 years ago, and much little used until the 1950s. I remember the first time I was introduced to the term was in Blacksburg, Virginia. I was giving a talk, a Black Swan talk, which is sort of an unanticipated event, like a derecho, and they had one come through. And this was, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So they're very unusual events. So few that I would say that there hasn't been much scholarly work done on whether they're attributed. That's the word we use now, is attribution science, when we try to figure out if a certain event is truly due to our warmer climate. So I don't think much real scholarly research has been done because the events are so few, but they're very serious and very strange. A great deal of moisture builds, in this case over Nebraska, in the upper atmosphere, and all of a sudden joins together and comes down as a derecho. And what's so unusual, worse than a tornado, as you pointed out, because it's so wide, where a tornado might be a mile wide, this was 20, 30, 50 miles wide. It kind of was centered on Highway 30, the Lincoln Highway across Iowa, and got much, much worse from Marshalltown to Cedar Rapids and on over to Dubuque. And I've driven all over there, George, and I tell you, there's an awful lot of damage. And now the corn that was knocked down is turning brown, so it really looks awful. Any silos or grain bins that didn't have corn in them were blown over, virtually all of them. And there really was a lot of damage. As you know, Cedar Rapids was incredible. Many people have said the damage and the extent of damage even worse than the 2008 flood there. And you know what that was like. Now, those events, the flood events, we think we can attribute now to climate change. At least the frequency of those events has increased as a result of a warmer Earth. And the frequency of severe hurricanes of the kind that we're experiencing now with Laura in the Gulf Coast. It's not the number of hurricanes that has increased by climate change, but rather pretty good evidence that it's the severity of the hurricanes which has increased due to the fuel for those hurricanes, which is a much warmer sea. Right now in the Gulf of Mexico, we're talking about 88 degree Fahrenheit surface temperatures, almost like bath water. So that is due to the frequency of those high impact storms has increased due to climate change.
Yeah, I turned on the CBS Evening News. I don't watch network news as much as I used to, but I tuned it in last night. My God, it was a horror show. I've never seen anything like it. I came of age, basically the Kennedy assassination was what made me first aware of the news. I've kind of been a news junkie my entire life. I've never seen a newscast like what I saw on the CBS Evening News last night, and it was a lot of it attributable to climate. These wildfires out in California, these hurricanes in the Gulf, one right after the other, slamming into each other. And of course, the follow-up on derecho here in the state of Iowa, and the impact of that economically is yet to be felt. I'm trying to highlight it and talk about it as much as I can. The next step, of course, is all that corn that's down that you mentioned about. That's going to get chopped and used for silage. That's not going to be worth much. That's going to become animal feed of the lowest order, I'm afraid. And what that'll do economically to the state and to the farmers is yet to be determined. Well, I also wanted to talk a little bit about, and you're involved in actively trying to promote, inform, make people understand climate in our daily lives. I've put forth on the podcast that a big change in the way we look at climate could come from weather forecasters. Believe it or not, everybody from the Weather Channel to the national networks, right down to the local meteorologists, the news people that work in your local communities. If they would talk about these unprecedented, now they used to be unprecedented, now they seem to be reoccurring all the time, weather tragedies and occurrences in the context of climate, people would maybe start to believe it and start to take action a little bit more. Because the way I put it is, these local weather guys, and you've seen it on local television, they're really popular. They got huge followings. People like them. They trust them. They report the weather, but they don't oftentimes put it in terms of climate. Do you see any change along those lines at all?
I do think it's changing, but I think it's changing slowly, George. Traditional education, most of these forecasters, especially on the local news, are meteorologists. They have a bachelor's degree, like from Iowa State, for example. And the curriculum tends to be, let's say, conservative in the sense that what people are taught, the meteorologists are taught, is that we have chaotic dynamics. The weather are classically chaotic. And that makes it very difficult to forecast and predict. But we've gotten better at that. The 7 to 9 day forecast is really much, much more accurate than it was even 10 or 15 years ago, because of the instrumentation of how we fly planes through the storms and through the atmosphere and gather data, big data, in real time, and we can make better forecasts. But what they're taught is that weather is chaotic, chaotic dynamic, and that it's very difficult to say that any one event is due to, for example, climate change. Now, because of that, in fact, our state climatologist for many years, Harry Hilliker, you probably maybe had him on the show, always would point out the highly variable nature of the statistics surrounding our climate. And only recently, I would say, have meteorologists, because the evidence is so strong. When I give a talk, George, I never talk about the models. We're running models at the University of Iowa in our center that predict out 50 years what it's going to be like, including backcasting or hindcasting to see if we can predict what has occurred in the past. I never talk about those models when I give a public talk, because I think just the data itself that we're experiencing day to day is sobering enough, and certainly quite enough information that we should be acting. When is it more expensive not to act than to act? And that's right now. If we don't act, it's going to be far more expensive than any mitigation measures we have to take right now.
Well, you're like me. You came out of college back in the 70s, and your entire life has been devoted to science, and now so much of the world, so much of this country anyway, is in science denial, it seems like. I saw one of your writings recently that I thought was very interesting, and you said that the response to the pandemic, COVID-19 here in the United States, is really analogous to the situation with climate change. Can you talk about that a little?
There's a lot of similarities, don't you think? One has to do with, denial of science, not listening to the scientists. And when you don't listen to the scientists, you pay later. We've learned that with COVID, and we're going to learn it with climate change as well, I think. So there are many, many parallels. We have to listen to the science. We have to think about when it's more prudent to act now in order to stem future events. That's true of both COVID-19 and climate change. One of the things that COVID-19 has allowed in our country and worldwide as well is these CARES Act, or the rebuilding funds that different legislatures have passed. And that's a golden opportunity for us to rebuild infrastructure.
Yes.
That makes us, more resilient to future flooding and future extreme weather events. And we can, and we should. I hope we don't miss the opportunity, but we should build back better, as one of our presidential candidates said. We need to use that money to make ourselves stronger and more resilient, because climate change is going to get worse before it gets better. And we're going to experience more of these events like we're seeing in the Gulf right now.
Well, it's Ironic that you bring up the CARES Act. I talk about it on the show all the time. I was outraged when that thing came down the pike because of exactly what you're talking about. And I called out all the progressives at the time. They needed to put in infrastructure. They needed to put in Medicare for all. They needed to put in all of these things that they wanted and needed because the Republicans really wanted this money, these $5 trillion to keep Wall Street afloat, basically, these major corporations. So this was their opportunity. They could have seized the moment. They didn't, and they're trying to do it now with follow-up legislation. But once the GOP mostly got everything they wanted in the way of funding, it's going to be extremely difficult to do. And so, we'll see what happens. But you're exactly right, and it proves that money is not the obstacle here. There is plenty of money. My God, that was the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of mankind, going back to the ancient pharaohs of Egypt. For God's sake, there is plenty of money to do this kind of stuff, and that was the opportunity. That was the chance to send some of it our way and to do some of these things that the people need so desperately. And they didn't get it done. Well, I don't want to get off on that tangent on this particular show because that's mostly political, Doc, but I did want to get with you. Of course, we're just coming out of this derecho here in the state of Iowa. What else has really raised your eyebrows recently when it comes to climate? I've seen the last ice shelf in Greenland collapse. I mean, my God, it is a horror show out there.
It is. Sea level is rising faster and faster. Remember that property you were thinking of buying down by Miami? Forget it. The real estate values are already plummeting. People are realizing that oil pipelines may not be such a smart investment, that we have to keep it in the ground. Why should you build a new pipeline at billions and billions of dollars that you can't use the oil? We have more oil in proven reserves, $2 trillion worth in proven reserves, that has to stay there. We can't afford to burn it. So the sooner people realize that and begin to invest in some of the infrastructure against flooding and infrastructure for new energy systems and a better grid and more battery storage, the better off we're going to be. And it's going to create lots of jobs and growth and prosperity, the engine for economic development in the future, George.
I have Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt, the Lucan Endowed Professor of Political Science from Iowa State University, on all the time, and he always says you may not like politics, but it likes you. You can't separate the two. And when you talk about climate, I'd prefer not to talk about politics, but you can't hardly avoid it. The Senate, have you had a time to digest or read that yet? They came out with a climate action report yesterday, and it was really tepid. It was lukewarm, and it's coming under fire from the climate groups particularly because it's even less. Well, it only mentioned the Green New Deal once, and that was in the footnotes. And there are some people that say the Green New Deal is maybe not enough by itself. Biden's got a proposal that's unlike anything he's ever done in his entire political career that does have some good points in it. Inslee signed on to it. Do you follow that stuff on a political basis, or are you more just involved on the science side of it?
I didn't read the Senate report, so I'm not familiar with that came out yesterday, but I am familiar with a lot of the other developments that you've mentioned. And of course, one positive development is the notion that we could pass a fee and dividend, put a fee on the cost of carbon in fuels that'll make them more expensive, and then collect that money and return it as a check monthly to each and every American citizen over the age of 18 equally. And so if you use a lot of energy, and wealthy people often do, maybe you're one of those wealthy people, George, I'm not sure. If you use a lot of energy, you're going to pay more because your petroleum is more expensive. But if you don't use a lot of energy, you're going to actually get a check back from the government for this fee or tax that has been collected, which will make you richer. And that will also cause people, incentivize them to use renewable resources, not to buy expensive petroleum chemicals. And it should allow us to invest in a more renewable and better future for climate change.
I'm all about that. I'm not one of the wealthy guys. My wife's big on. We want to have solar and wind power. I wish they could come up with a homeowner wind generator to power your own home. I mean, we'd be doing that. I'd be powering Podcast by George that way if I could. I read.
I think Mason City in Iowa does have regulations that you can have home wind generator. I think they may be the only city in Iowa, if I'm not mistaken.
Wouldn't that be cool? I talk about music a lot on the show, Doc. Some of my favorite musicians, one of which is Jackson Brown, that I'm sure you're aware of. And he's got a recording studio that's entirely, I mean, his whole compound, his home, everything is off the grid, basically. He is powered alternatively by solar and wind, and he's not using the grid at all to bring us that great music. So if he can do that, I ought to be able to do it with Podcast by George. Well, we've run out of time. It goes by quickly. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic coming out of derecho. You've got another fall semester starting. Are you teaching remotely this year? And kind of when it comes to climate, what's your main point? What's your thesis? What are you trying to get across to students right now?
I am teaching remotely. In fact, I just got done with a group of students a minute before our podcast. And what I'd like to say is that this really does represent an opportunity to create jobs and to overcome climate change. Thank heavens when 2020 is over, George, because who would have thought we would be dealing with racism and wealth inequities and climate change and COVID-19 all at the same time. I'm thinking about my son right now who lives in Monterey, California. He's evacuated from his home, and his home is basically surrounded by fire right now. I'm thinking of the people in St. Charles, in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is at the center of Laura coming ashore right now. I'm thinking of all the Iowans still trying to overcome the derecho from just 2 weeks ago. Let's have our thoughts and prayers be with them and hope that we can take this bull by the horns and do something, create opportunities for the future, and overcome climate change.
Oh, that's great, Doc. I couldn't close it up any better than that. That's great. The only thing I would add, a little bit in tongue-in-cheek, when I put it on my Facebook page, NASA and the scientists say there's some kind of an asteroid headed towards Earth. Honest to God, this is the truth. The thing is going to come close, and it's supposed to come closest the day before the November election. I mean, look it up. It's not. It sounds like something crazy out of the National Enquirer, but that would put the icing on the cake for 2020 if an asteroid were to come and a giant fireball from the sky take us all out right before we decide who the next president's going to be. But anyway, thanks.
My wife and I have some friends who were playing apocalypse bingo, and nobody had derecho. They didn't even have it on their scorecard.
Nobody's heard of it. Doc, thanks again for coming back on a Podcast by George.
Take care. Thank you.
That's Dr. Jerry Schnur, folks. He's the co-director and co-founder of Iowa Environmental Focus. That's a product of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research. And of course, he's an instructor, a professor out at the University of Iowa, talking about all things climate, weather-related, and particularly with the water and the aquatics. I mean, that's just great stuff. And I hope you like Podcast by George. I'm encouraging everybody to go to podcastbygeorge.com. Choose the platform that you'd like to follow us on, subscribe, and get each and every episode. And just like as I started, as Lee Camp recommends, I'm going to keep coming back, maybe not on every show, but I'm going to mention climate a lot. You're going to get a lot of it because of the 2020 world that we live in. That's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for now. That's another podcast by George.